we broke, broke, broke. If I broke, we ain't got it. Broke, broke, broke. If I broke, yo, man, we start this show every week acknowledging that it's hard out here. It's hard out here, yo. And part of the reason why it's hard out here is because of the economic state of things. This conversation right here kicked off with a discussion of trickle down economics. Our illustrious producer, Hassan, brought it to us as the myth of trickle down economics. And we got some pushback from my entrepreneurially inclined brother and confidant. So let's get into it.
You see, I think what you do so well, Miles, is be able to package things in a very beautiful manner. Because what actually happened was a full fight. It's a full fight. Our producer actually was acting like Don King promoting the fight. I believe he told us to get our gats ready for this conversation. So a lot of the times in figuring out what the best thing to talk about is how we talk about it. And they will be like, all right, cool. This is some dope shit to get into. So that was one of those fights. And I said vehemently that I don't want to be put in a place where I'm defending capitalism like the evil one. And that seems to be the corner you've immediately painted me into.
I'm not trying to paint you in that corner. And I don't even think that like evil is the word that I wanna throw around in terms of capitalism. Because I think even where I'm at currently, there's a foundation for, and we'll get into the terms, but like social democracy that still maintains a lot of capitalistic elements that I think it's possible to work around. It's possible to find a middle ground. But I think so. Let's acknowledge that that is in the air, right? A lot of people are saying capitalism is evil. That's something. Eat the rich. We had that conversation in regard to Jay-Z last week. That is something that people are throwing out there. I'm not coming to you, my brother, my dog, with that energy. I'm just saying. I think we both see that energy out there. I agree with the critique of capitalism without going so far as to say everybody who believes in it is evil, but I think that pressure is real. So let's explore your belief. Maybe we can start with trickle down economics and then expand in terms of like I don't want you to have to defend it, but explain how you feel comfortable being a capitalist in light of all of the ways that we've seen it affect people and in light of the criticisms that are upon it now.
For one, I don't walk around thinking I'm a capitalist. That's for one, right? I'm not moving around being like I'm gonna make a capitalist decision today and like join the capitalist group on WhatsApp where we share propaganda. That's not the case, right? So part of the reason why we all seem to be on there's a lot of room for extreme ends where it's like eat the rich on one side, but then on the other side you have the rich who are then being the ones that are supporting a lot of these foundations more than anybody else. So it's a bit of that it seems like we're on opposite ends of the spectrum. But in actuality, there's a lot that we can each borrow from because the system of capitalism is made up. I believe in fairness, in the ability for anyone to have access to resources in order to be able to create, to work, to exist. The pursuit of freedom, as they put it as they put it in the Constitution. Everyone has the right to the pursuit of freedom. So a capitalist society is one where ideally in its ideal state it can create that, but in its perverse state, which I believe we are very much in right now, it's highly unfair.
Got you. So just slow walking this thing. You believe in capitalism as an economic system that it's the optimal economic system, and feel that it promotes equality or efficiency, or what's that word there that you would put at the end of that?
Opportunity. Operating at its ideal state, it can create opportunity, right? And I think the question we were the term that kicked off this conversation was trickle down economics, which would then be the idea that as money moves from money has a trickle down effect. So think of a stack of champagne glasses like we have here for our YouTube audience, and as you keep filling up the top of the champagne glass, which would insinuate the 1%, and that's the people at the very top end of the echelon who are receiving the most, and then that will spill down towards all the other glasses towards them. That's trickle down economics. Do you interpret that term in the same way? Are we speaking on the same language?
We are, yeah. And so you believe that this is an effective way of serving everyone's best interests, including the citizens at the bottom.
No, that's not what I said. What I said was that trickle down economics does happen. It doesn't happen at the rate that we might want it to, but it does happen, because and that's just like that's taking a very matter of fact approach about it, right? That's not taking a fully conscious approach about it. Just saying like technically it actually does happen, because even if money is moved in a transaction, that is transaction fees. Those transaction fees pay salaries. Those salaries get passed down to families. Those families then, there's always a trickle down effect that occurs. But is it a fair trickle down effect we're seeing now? I would be hard pressed to argue that. Argue that it isn't. I think it is unfair, to clarify.
Cool. I'm glad we can agree on that, right? Trickle down economics is unfair. There's a baseline to start with. I'm glad you said matter of fact. We you describe it as a fight. It was a kerfuffle, right? Before the podcast, we decided we was gonna bring some facts to this. So one of the sources that I found in terms of facts is the 2022 World Inequality Report, right? The aim of the Inequality Report is to present the latest and most complete data available on inequality to inform democratic debate. That's what this is. That's the word for it, right? Debate, right? And it brings data together from the World Wealth and Income Database from countries around the world, right? I'm going to hit y'all with some facts real quick, and then I want my brother to react, right? Global inequity increased between 1820 and 1910. Basically, this was in the context of Western colonial empires. And then it stabilized for a long time between 1910 and 1920. And the reason at a very high level, right? So global inequality increases and then stays very high. The only reason it doesn't keep increasing is because while within countries, the richer are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, right? Like the richest people in poorer countries are getting closer to the rich and wealthier countries. That gap is getting smaller. While for most countries across the world, the gap between the rich and poor is getting wider. So rich and poor gap getting wider, rich and rich gap getting smaller, that equals out to stabilization of a high level of inequality, right? There's income inequality, which is how much people earn, and then there's wealth inequality. The poorest half of the global population owns 2% of the global wealth, right? Like
that's 2%. A wild fact.
Yeah. The poorest half of the global population owns 2% of the total wealth in terms of ownership, right? The richest 10% of the population owns 76% of the wealth, right? The top 1% of global earners took 38% of all the additional wealth accumulated since the 1990s. Of all the wealth that existed in 1990 until 2020, the top 1% took 38% of all the additional wealth generated, right? The wealth of the richest individuals on earth has grown 6 to 9% per year since 1955, whereas the average wealth has grown 3.2%.
You see, what my brother just did is he said, we'll make Zwe react to facts, and then proceeded to read out 20 individual facts.
But But I'm just saying, I would say that supports that. Go ahead.
You see, I don't disagree. And matter of fact, the statistic a statistic that's part of those numbers is that over the last 2 years, there have been the most amount of people who have migrated into poverty, as well as the same time as the most amount of billionaires being created, which further indicates how is how unfair the system is at the moment. And not to speak of the system as this lofty mythical being, but speaking of the system of where people are allowed to engage in the economy and what they receive for their efforts, and then on the other end, what is actually being paid, and how people make those wealths. And I think when we look at how wealth is made in today's context, a lot of it does come from a very unethical mismanagement of people and their resources. So when we take some of the top richest companies right now, like Meta, and you realize that Meta, through acts like Cambridge Analytica, was at a point where they were selling our data towards these campaign marketing companies, who then able to twist it and then manipulate an election, which is what happened. So that obviously comes at the detriment of our safety, our safety as users on this massive platform, and they made billions of dollars on it. Apple with Cobalt, all of us who have phones are participating in part of a system in where a lot of wealth is being taken from countries like Chile, countries like even in a lot of African countries, where they produce this mineral that is in all of our phones. So, that I think when we look at the top 1% and how they've made their capital, that's where we go, okay, that is unethical. But the system itself is something that we've created. So this idea of capitalism is something that we've created. And I believe that we can always shift it into being something that can help us more so than it can hurt us.
What do you mean? Who do you mean when you say we've created capitalism?
It's by we, and this is where we're getting real meta, okay? So brace yourselves. But capitalism is a reflection, can be seen as a reflection of the consumer ethics. So it's kind of like in the same way that a president, no matter how vile they are, is an actual true reflection of who the people of the country are and the state of the country. Or in the same way, how violent hip hop is indicative of how violent the streets are. You know what I mean? It's the same thing when it comes to this capitalism, is that how bad it is reflecting the state of how we are as a society, and that we award bad behavior, we award theft, we are comfortable delegating a lot of rights and responsibility and accountability that could put checks into places. We defer that and make it seem as something that is not for us, and we rely on these experts who at the times we don't even interrogate on how valid they are in understanding the idea. And then we have a perverse relationship with ourselves in social media, and also believing in high and making up fake riches, and then being depressed, and we're caught up in that cycle. It gets deep.
And you feel like those things are our internal problems that play out in capitalism versus capitalism's focus on profit and earnings, creating or contributing to those problems.
Earnings and profit don't always have to be a bad thing. A good example is that Patagonia, the CEO, the founder of Patagonia this weekend gave up a company worth $3.8 billion. So all the profits that Patagonia sees, which actually is its revenue as a company is around $400 million a year. It's a pretty big company. He's saying this company now is an NGO. Patagonia is effectively an NGO. All the profits that this company makes are then are now moved into helping people, right? So when I look at that aspect of capitalism that has allowed for this company to be a multi-billion-dollar institution that now can direct funds back, that's still within the realm of what's possible in capitalism. But that's not necessarily the case of what's happening.
But it's a really interesting example because taking all of those resources and all of that capital, right, that company represents and putting it in the hands of a collective is pretty socialist. You know what I'm saying? So it's funny because I think where I land on the economic spectrum for now, as I continue my quest leftward, is like social democracy, where I understand the benefits of being able to create capital and to create certain efficiencies that capitalism has. But I think the idea that not putting a limit on either profit or not putting a very clear regulations on how much companies need to give back to social welfare is foolish. And so I think we need to focus on those things. And I think there are lots of ways in which we already do that. There are serious problems with public schools. There are inefficiencies in public transportation. There are imperfect systems of public health care around the world. But I think that we can, in certain areas, we've agreed that we need to maintain a certain accessibility for essential services. So let them run up the iPhones. Let them run up the Samsung TVs. Let it be 25K, 37K, whatever it is. But when it comes to land, house, bread, education, let's make sure that those things are set at an affordable level. And that's the extent to which I think socialism has a place in this conversation.
You know, speaking of where socialism can particularly work, how familiar are you with like the Norwegian and Scandinavian system of socialism, and is that a type of socialism that you see as the best example of it?
I think they're a funny example because from when I was like kind of doing some of my research, I found out that they don't like to be used as an example for socialism. They don't call their practices socialist. But I think Denmark and yeah, some of those other Scandinavian countries, in the ways that they've created a social safety net that isn't that's a net good, right? Get it? Social safety net that's a net good, right? Because in a certain respects, a lot what those Scandinavian countries have showed us is that you can create a safety net for people, and sometimes that slows down the growth of your GDP, right? But at a certain point, every country is in a different place to decide this. But I think a lot of countries would find that the overall net good of people is improved if you are willing to slow down on some of that GDP growth. And this also brings climate change into the conversation, right? But slowing down and allowing and preparing for a slowdown in that GDP growth, allocating spending accordingly, but knowing that the reason for that GDP growth is that you're creating a social safety net that raises the quality of life for the people with the least means, I think is something that you have to be prepared for. So they're like socialism is a very like is can be very extreme, and what Scandinavian countries have implemented isn't exactly that, but I think it does serve as a model for what we can think about implementing here and stop being so afraid of in terms of letting those ideas make up where capitalism is really failing us.
I like what you said about a social safety net being considered, and that's where I see the ability to be able to adopt these different, if you will, socialist elements into capitalism, which is what I think the Scandinavian countries are doing. Now, where it gets again on the extreme side where it's perverse, we're seeing bankers now trying to put into motion a bill that will allow them to remove the ceiling cap on what they can earn in bonuses. And the whole bonus culture, if you track it back to how it transformed banking for, as we know it now, the whole reason banks are so aggressive in pushing credit and those types of things stems back to banks being granted these bonuses in terms of these massive bonuses and what they can make, right? So I like that social safety net and putting that into place. As a community activist, Mr. Miles Xavier, and as a trusted brain and thought leader in making Chicago a better place, here I am, gang of money, and I want to come to you as a person who's got his money through capitalist endeavors. How do I apply the social safety net, and what would you do with it?
Man, it depends on what your business is and what capital that's not just financial that you have that we can use already. Do you have space? Do you have factories? Like, can we employ people? But not only employ people through the capital that you've been able to build, but you're gonna have to let go of, like, you're gonna have to not just give away some of the money, you're gonna have to give away some of the ownership. That's what we want to democratize, is the ownership. In the same way that we've seen folks at Amazon and folks at Tesla like come together to unionize to have a greater piece of the pie of what these multi-million billion dollars companies are producing. We want you to give up some of that infrastructure and give up that means of production so that those people not only reap what you're able to give them off the top of your profits, but they take their piece first. That's what I would say. Give it up in that sense. And I want to address what you said about the bankers too, because it illustrates like the key problem with capitalism that I think we, even if we, how much of it we keep or disregard, we need to address, is that capitalism relies on the people at the top to be their most magnanimous self, like to be their most giving, generous self, right? The idea is that everybody is Zway. The idea is that everybody is hungry ass Zway who made it to the top with love and support from his village and remembers that where he came from and wants to spend money and give it all back, right? Or even less ideal than that, that at least they made it to the top, they're going to spend a lot of money and that's going to trickle down to people that need money. But that's not what happens. Those people at the top take them big bonuses, they take them salaries and they hide them in offshore bank accounts, right? They hide them in places where they can rack up a lot of interest, but they don't get spent. Those dollars don't circulate in the United States, let alone circulate in the neighborhoods that are at the bottom of that totem pole. So that's the issue, man. We need to make sure that those dollars circulate. We can't leave it. We can't think that everybody gonna be Zway, man. We gotta make sure that there are systems in place that say this is what Zway would do with this money if he was a billionaire capitalist, and this is what you gonna do with it too.
So ask yourself, WWZD, what would Zway do? You know what I mean? And yo, I hate that you forced that out of me. I don't, but I appreciate it.
It's the highest compliment I can give you is that I would trust you with those funds and that power. We gotta make sure that everybody that gets there, if they're not that trustworthy, there's a mechanism to say, come on, man, you can't be paying zero taxes while people starving.
You know, one of the things that drives me is being able to show that you can become wealthy helping people. I think that's so important. That's so important. If we can all understand that there is a way to make a living helping people, and not just a living. You know, that's why we want to make this thing look fly. You know, that's why we take such a careful approach to the aesthetic of helping people, because the perception is that when you helping people is a pauper's game. You know, you see some of the people that have been the most giving also be the ones who have the least. Jesus died a pauper. Gandhi moved from a palace into a panhandler. There's all these different examples around us. Mother Teresa, if you consider a good person, it gets controversial on that one. But still, apparently she was killing black babies, dude. It's wild.
Yo, but I appreciate what you're saying, and I appreciate, yeah, like the type of person that you are. You the aesthetic that you speak of, you put this shirt on me. You saw me out here looking like a pauper, you know what I'm saying? I was like a po pimp. And he was like, you know what? Hold this right quick. Now I'm fresh. That's the type of billionaire Zway is.